Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Golden Key Asia Pacific webinar series. My name is Winnie. I am the Marketing and Partnerships Officer here at Golden Key. I'm really excited to be hosting this session. Today, our topic is Overcoming Your Fear of Interviews, presented by Susan Hervey. So a couple of things before we get started. First of all, today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the Golden Key YouTube channel afterwards. So you should be able to access the videos in a couple of weeks. If you miss anything, you can catch up afterwards. Next, if you have any questions for the speaker, just pop them into the question box in your Zoom control panel, or you can chat with us in the chat section. We'll be running a live Q&A at the end, and we will try to circle back to you if we don't get to your questions during the webinar. Alrighty, now I will turn the time over to our presenter today, Susan Hervey. This is not the first time that we partner with her. We just, talked about it. But in this year's Golden Key Summit in Brisbane, we were lucky to be joined by her in our career panel. So Susan is the Director of Career Services at the University of Adelaide. She's worked in the career development field for over a decade. She holds qualifications in education, recreation and sports management, and career development. Prior to working for the university, she managed employment services within TAFE in Northern Adelaide. She also managed one of the largest regional TAFE campuses in Australia. In the decade after graduating, Susan worked in the private sector in a variety of management, entertainment, and consultancy roles. She's been a professional member of the Career Development Association of Australia since 2001, and she's now a former Vice President, National Association of Graduate Career Advisory Services. She's also completing a research master's through the Universities of Southern Queensland. Her areas of research interest include the impact of relocation on career outcomes and the effect that typology has on career and life choices. Welcome, Susan. Over to you.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us after hours today. Thank you for the introduction, Winnie. I think everyone would have got a good idea about how many jobs I might have had in the past and how many interviews I would have needed to attend in order to get those jobs. So hopefully you can benefit from some of that experience that I've had in the past. So here's the overview of what I'm hoping to cover today. I'm going to go through the different types of interviews. I'm going to touch on online interviews. Obviously, that's become a lot more popular format over the last couple of months, and I think moving forward, employers are going to do more and more of it. Certainly, it's a cheaper way to interview people. You don't have to fly them in to where you're actually having the in-person interview, and you can probably do a lot more if we're going to look at something like group assessment centres and exactly how many people could partake in those versus in physical, in person. We're going to have a look at first impressions and how important that is. If you only have, say, a 10-minute interview or a 30-minute interview, becomes very important. The interview process from sort of start to finish, what that actually looks like, and in all of the interviews I've had, they're very, very similar, I have to say. We're going to look at the STAR framework. So that will give you a model so that you will never go blank again in an interview. And it will also help you with your selection criteria addresses. So the framework has a dual purpose. And if we get time, at the very end, I'll offer some career advice. Okay, so that's what we're hoping to achieve today. This is one of the quotes I came across when I first started teaching interviews after having had so many myself. And I think it's really important, and people don't often put a lot of thought into an interview until it's right on their doorstep, like it's coming up the next day or the next week, or it's a job that they're very, very interested in. And then they suddenly think, oh, I better, brush up on my interview skills. And this quote pretty much sums up the importance of why you should really be great at interviews. Because Winston Churchill was talking about people that had done many, many things at many levels of experience, and he saw one thing connecting them all, and that was their ability to present in job interviews. Okay, so it's a really important skill. Now, I always think that an interview could be compared to the game of Survivor, simply because there's many contestants or competitors, and you're trying to shortlist anything from maybe 2,000 competitors or 200 competitors down to one generally. So, I mean, if I go back 20 years, I can remember when recruitment agents did most of the recruiting for companies and organisations, and there was a job I really wanted, and 400 competitors were wanting the same job, and they shortlisted to 4 and then interviewed 2, and I didn't get that job. And I really wanted it. So that was a disappointment. So for all the jobs that I've actually had, I've probably had twice as many interviews because, of course, you know, we all come second every now and again. You can't always win the job. And so don't beat yourself up if you've come second for a job. There'll be another job waiting for you. I think when people think about interviews, whether they've got one coming up or they're just reflecting on interviews that they've had, or possibly their role might be coming to an end and they know they have to enter the recruitment phases again, this slide sort of sums up how people actually feel. And, you know, even the word interview, it makes people feel stressed, I think. It's not a pleasant experience generally. The word interview is an old French word. Entrevoir, I think is how you would say it. And what that referred to was a meeting of very important monarchs or officials, so a face-to-face meeting. That's the origins of the word. When I think of the word interview, I tend to think we are calling you in to view you. So that's how I, you know, what meaning I sort of put on to the term. So I'm hoping at the end of our session today that you won't feel as stressed as the people look in these pictures. And I would hope that you will feel a bit more relaxed. And I think because it's the end of the day and because, you know, you've probably rushed to get onto this webinar from everything else you've been doing, I want people to relax a little bit. And so have a look at this picture and focus on it for a minute, because I just don't think it's worth stressing over getting to an interview and trying to perform well, because we just want you to be yourself at the end of the day. And the more relaxed you are, I think the better you're going to perform. So this is one of the tricks that I use to try and relax, is to look at, you know, one of the holiday venues I might have been to in the past or one I'd like to go to in the future. And that's one of the ways that I help myself to relax. So a little tip to remember for the future. And hopefully, like I said, by the end of today, when we've gone through some of the techniques, you might be feeling a bit more relaxed about your next interview. Now, another tip I want to give you that might make you feel a little bit more relaxed about your next interview is that the people sitting on the other side of the table are very, very nervous as well. Okay, they often don't look nervous, you know, they're dressed very well, and, you know, they've probably got the company mission sitting in the background and they're in a boardroom and they don't look stressed. But given that I've been on the interviewing side of the table quite often, I can tell you that it is very, very stressful. And some of you have probably interviewed people as well for various roles, and you would know the pressure that you feel to try and make a good decision. I always feel at least as nervous, I think, as the candidates on the other side, because I know I only get one chance. It's a very expensive process to go through a recruiting campaign. I'm hoping that the right applicants have applied and I've shortlisted, you know, appropriate people. And then out of all the people I'm looking at, I'm hoping I choose the right person for my team, someone that's going to fit in, someone that's going to do what they say they can do. So try and remember this. When you're in an interview, the people may not look nervous, but they are, okay? Okay, so there are various types of interviews, and I'm sure some of you have, you know, done at least one of these, maybe more. So the one-on-one interview is the one that most of us know about. So that's just with one other person, they've called you into interview, and, you know, that's probably one of the more relaxed type of interviews, simply because there's only one person to impress. Now, the problem with a one-person interview versus, say, a panel is that if you don't impress that particular person or they don't like you for some reason, then there's only one person making the choice. Okay, so that's the one-on-one interview. With the panel, I've been interviewed up to about 5 people, I think, would be the most you might see on a panel. I've heard that in China, sometimes panels can take up to 20 people who all have a stake in the decision that's going to be made. So the panel interview, there's generally 3 people on the panel. One of those people is probably going to be the direct supervisor for the role they've advertised. There'll be a subject specialist, maybe an engineer or a HR person, and there'll be a third person who may not be related to the role at all. They may be there because we might already have 2 men interviewing, so we pull in a woman to get the gender balance. It may be someone who's very experienced in interviewing. I'm often called into other panels that are not related at all to my area. So that's who you'll find on a panel, and it's important to talk to all 3 of the people. Generally, you might find you have a connection with one of the people more than the other 2, and you tend to focus on that one, but it is important to give all of your attention equally between however many people are on the panel. With group interviews, that's when, look, I've seen group interviews up to 100. So many people are coming in for a group interview, and the employer is running, the questions by everybody. There might be some group exercises. It's probably a smaller version of what we would call an assessment centre. So assessment centres can be, 10 people, they can be 100 people, could be 300 people, and they are also in groups generally to try and make it workable. And the groups here would be presenting, sometimes just by themselves, or they might make a group presentation after they've done an exercise. There'll be a problem to solve. And so assessors are generally, we've often done this in person, but now it's being done virtually. So assessors are looking at each of the participants' contribution to the team, what ideas they're coming up with, and giving marks basically to try and shortlist out of the 100 people we have in front of us, or the 10 people. So group interviews and assessment centres are pretty similar in lots of ways. There'll be inbox exercises to do. Like I said, there'll be problem solving. They may have a real problem that a company needs to solve, so they've got all this talent in the room, and they offer up that problem for some new ideas. And it's about, I think we're looking for leadership sometimes, we're looking for inclusion. There are so many different skills that we're looking for in an assessment centre, and it's trying to cover off on all the skills you think you have that you would like to, present to the assessors. And it's not a time to be sitting back and being humble. You really have to try and stand out in an assessment centre or a group interview, and so the assessors are actually focused on you, or the interviewers are listening to what you've got to say. There are many other types of interviews. Often there'll be a phone interview. Before we get to any of these in-person or virtual interviews, someone may call you, and the phone interview is often used as a screening interview to try and select the strongest candidates. There may be an informal interview, something like, oh, let's go and meet for coffee somewhere. Now that's a very formal interview. Even though it feels informal, you are still being assessed as if you were in front of a panel of 3 people. So it is not a time to feel relaxed in an informal coffee interview, because each interview you're working your way toward hopefully being offered the job. Sometimes there's hidden interviews, like you may be being interviewed when you don't even know it. So for me, whatever I'm doing, whether I'm in the university or at a conference or an exhibition or even at a barbecue, I'm always thinking, wow, that person would be such a great person on my team. Or likewise, I might think, oh, I would never hire that person. So, some people are always recruiting. They're always looking for talent, and I certainly am always on the lookout for someone that I think could add to my team. So you never really know when you're being interviewed sometimes. Okay, so on to online interviews. This is fairly standard boardroom these days with lots of screens. Sometimes there'll be 3 people, there might be 1 person. With virtual, you never know how many people are involved sometimes. But there's lots of things you can do to try and give yourself an advantage with online interviews. I'm sure they're very new for a lot of people. The technology is something that you really need to get right from the start. You need to look at your bandwidth, so don't have too many devices on at the same time. Make sure your link isn't going to drop out, because if you're on an interview or an assessment centre, the last thing you need is to be missing for any length of time while other people are there and you know, being assessed. So your technology is very, very important. If you don't have the technology at home, it's important to, you know, maybe go to university, or maybe even in your workplace, you know, borrow a room, or you just need a really quiet place to conduct, you know, an interview or a webinar like we're doing at the moment. So technology, make sure you have all the right things that you need. Lighting is really important too. So the best lighting is often if you face a window. So not so bright that, you know, it blinds you, but facing a window can, you know, sort of stop some of the shadows that come around. If we, like today, I'm lit sort of from this side, so you'll see some shadows on my face. Now, when I set up before, it was light outside and the lights were on because people were in the office behind me. But of course, everyone's gone home, and with no movement, the lights go off. So the light in here changes a bit. But lighting's really important. And if you don't have windows, you can sometimes set up a lamp sort of over the other side of your computer to light you from the front. So that might give you some nice lighting as well. But it is important to be, you know, to be clear, have your image as a clear one. The background's important as well. So I know some people set up a special space now that, you know, most of us are working from home, so that, you know, the rest of their room might be really messy, but certainly the area behind them is, you know, very tidy and professional. So even if you're at work, like now, you know, I just have windows behind me, but it's important to have a look at the background, because all of these things are contributing to first impressions. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, focus and minimize distractions. And by that, I mean your own distractions. So no, you know, playing with your hair or an earring or your collar or a tie or anything like that. You need to try and be as still as you can. And so all the focus is on your face and your voice. What to wear. I'm not going to focus too much on this. I think most of you would know what to wear for an interview. In a virtual interview, sometimes people just dress their top half of their body. And I wouldn't recommend that, because you never know when you might have to stand up and move away, or so dress fully as if you were, you know, going to an interview in person. One-way interviews. Okay, so this is when there's not an interviewer on the other side. It's just going to, the technology is going to record your answers, and then one person or numerous people are going to assess those at a later date. So one-way interviews are difficult in that you're not going to get any feedback whatsoever. And how they normally operate is a question will come up on the screen, like an interview question, and you will need to answer that, and you'll probably have a time frame to do it in. So 1 minute, 2 minutes, that sort of thing. And often you don't get a second chance. I have seen some technology where you can go back and review your answer and give another one if you weren't happy, but most of the time that will be it. So the key to a one-way interview is to really know your resume and your application documents, and really think about some of the questions that you might be asked, so that you're ready when they pop up on the screen and away you go. Minimize interruptions. By this, I mean not interruptions that, you know, or distractions you're doing yourself, but things that are happening around you. So I'm in an office now where there's nobody behind me at all, whereas normally that office, you know, in normal times would be quite full. At home, there might be other family members, your cat, all sorts of things, traffic noise, builders building next door. So you really need to think about this when you're setting up where your interview is going to happen. And I'm sure you've probably all seen this, you know, just when you think, you know, you've done everything right and nothing could possibly go wrong because you've ticked all the boxes. This man had obviously, you know, done a lot of interviews before, but I don't think he was expecting his 2 little children to come in the door, and it really it went viral, this particular ad. But you could just see the man. If you haven't seen it, just Google, you know, BBC reporter with children, and it will come up, and you can have a look, and you can just see how mortified he actually is that he didn't have, you know, this particular situation under control. So like I said, the best laid plans can sometimes go astray, but do all that you can to let people know if they're in the vicinity, look, I'm having a very important interview, please just give me the half an hour or the hour or whatever it is that you need. Okay, this is really important for online interviews. So like the camera setup, about an arm's length away from your screen is probably ideal. If you get too close, you sort of start to pixelate and look a little bit like this. So that's something really important to remember. Okay, so let's have a look at communication. This was a really old study, so done in the 1970s. It's still used today. Maybe you've seen the results of this study. I would start by saying it can't be used in every, for every form of communication, but it's really useful to have a look at this when you're really worried about what you might say, because when we're creating a first impression, people do really focus on how you look and then how you sound. And so the words that this study proved were, the least of anyone's worries. And where this study really comes into its own is when those two messages are incongruent. So, when you're in an interview situation, you are very, very nervous normally, but you're trying really hard to act confident. And so it's really important that your body language matches the words that you're saying. Okay, so when we speak, it's normally within a tenth of a second that people can make up their mind about whether they like you or not. Okay, and like comes down to two things, which is dominance and trustworthiness, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. Okay, so first impression, this is just how the brain processes things. This is exactly the order that it happens in. And certainly with touch, handshakes are no longer part of business because of the coronavirus. So with a handshake, you can often get a lot of information about people, their level of confidence, all sorts of things. So I know interview rooms have sometimes been set up, a long way from where the interview table actually is, so people can have a look at the competitors coming in and handshake and then sitting down and what articles or folders they bring with them, and how they start the interview. So you're often being watched from maybe the time that you get out of your car or out of the lift to the time that you actually leave the building. So that's something to be aware of as well, because it may not only be the panel that's being asked about you, other people such as receptionists or gardeners, I do know have been asked for their opinion on candidates in the past. But yeah, as I said, handshaking will no longer be part of our business world. Okay, so these are just some interesting things that I thought I could tell you about. Sometimes an interview is very quick. If there's a lot of candidates, it might be 10 minutes. The longer generally an interview goes, the more likely you are to win the position, because it's a very big investment to be spending time with people out of a normal busy day. So the longer an interview goes, the more confident you can probably be that you might be the person that's going to win the job. Sometimes it's a lot longer, like just before the global financial crisis. I remember I was working here at the university and some recruitment processes ran over a couple of days and people were being flown from one side of the country to the other. That's how, ever since the global financial crisis, that hasn't occurred to my knowledge, but it used to be quite common. And the hiring decision, as much as we have to go through these processes, that first impression is often clouding a yes or no decision. So that's something important to know as well. And like I said, it can be created in almost the time it says to say hello, an impression is created. I do also want you to know that regardless of how well you conduct your own interview, what great answers you give, how much you actually want a job, sometimes the interview decision and who people hire is well out of your control. Maybe there's already someone sitting in the position that's interviewed well. We would expect, an internal incumbent to interview very well for a job that they've been in. Sometimes it's the number of people already interviewed. If a panel's already sat through 7 or 8 interviews and found an outstanding candidate, then they may not be as invested in the next 3 people that they see. there's a whole lot of bias that comes in, and you've probably heard the term unconscious bias. And if you think about, if you were hiring, you know, if you had a laundry list of, okay, what am I looking for in another person to join me, then of course, you know, you bring all your biases with you as well. I think it's just the human condition, and it's really important as experienced interviewers to be aware of those and try and negate them. So what questions are likely to be asked during an interview? Everybody wants to know this, and given that I think I've had about 59 interviews now trying to get all those jobs, and obviously some others that I didn't get, I would have to say that interviews that I've had are pretty similar. You know, if you've had enough interviews, you'll start to see the process repeat over and over. To find out what questions are likely to be asked in the interview, look at the job advertisement. They really should be coming from there, or the position description. That's where most of the questions are likely to be formed from. However, interviews are very subjective, and people will ask you all sorts of things that you may or may not have been expecting. I can remember, you know, about 5 years ago, what sort of animal would you be if you're an animal? Those sort of questions. The dining room table, if you could have 6 people over to dinner, anyone in the world, living or dead, who would that be? So, you know, these questions are all designed to try and find out a bit more about you as a person. Okay, so the interview process, to me, it's like a circle. It starts and it finishes, and it always starts, in my experience, with the same question. And that first question is generally, tell us about yourself. Now, that is a really easy answer to prepare because you know yourself better than anyone. It's something that you can practice, write down if you have to. One of the tips I would like to pass on that really helped me over the years is, after I would go to an interview, and whether it had gone well or not, I would write down the questions, and then if I'd given a really good answer, I'd write that answer down. And if I'd given a bad answer, I would try and improve that answer and think of how I really should have answered the question. Now, if you've been to an interview, you've all done that. You've come out and thought, oh, question 2, I really should have said that. I have so many examples I could have given, but that's after the interview when you're not stressed anymore. So if you get a curly question or one that you didn't answer very well, you know, keep an electronic file about these interview questions and write down what you would have said. And when it comes time to go to the next interview, you have this, you know, running list of questions that you may be asked again. And certainly in my experience, I've been asked the same things over and over again. And you have all your great answers there to sort of refresh in your mind some examples that you may have forgotten. You know, I've worked in 7 industries. So when I read my, you know, book of interview questions, I think, oh, that's right, I'd forgotten I worked in that industry and I achieved all of that, and I can bring that to their attention tomorrow if it's relevant. Okay, so relevance is the key to whether you bring up the experience or not. If it's relevant to the new job, then of course, you know, you try and weave it into an interview. Okay, so warm-up questions. They're designed to try and make you feel as relaxed as you possibly can in a very high-stress situation. Okay, and always remember the interviewers are very stressed as well. They're hoping to make the right choice. So these warm-up questions, you know, they tell the employees about your history and why you've applied for this job. You know, what is it about, you know, this job that all of your experience has, you know, brought you to this point. And again, it's a chance for them to find out about you as a person. So if you can mention, you know, start with your current work and your current hobbies and maybe work backward and anything relevant in your past. And it is a chance for them to find out a bit more about you than, you know, than the professional person. You know, you might bring in some of your hobbies that may or may not be relevant. I do know of someone who was hired on the basis of the hobby that they had. They were a scuba diver, and so was the boss that was, you know, doing the hiring and had the final say, and he was looking for a scuba buddy. So when he came down to, you know, 3 people had all the skills that they needed, but the one candidate had scuba diving as a hobby, well, that's who he hired. So you never know what might you know, be the competitive edge for you. So tell us about yourself. You can all practice that if you don't have the answer already. everyone would like to know, you know, why you chose their company, why you chose the study program that you chose. Okay, and I think you must do your research about the company or the organisations that you're wanting to work for. One of the biggest criticisms that employers will say to me is they just didn't know anything about us, you know, so why would I hire them? So make sure you do your research for the organisations you're hoping to work for. So after the warm-up questions come the competency questions. So this is where an employer is trying to work out, can you really do the job? Okay. And how they do that is by using behavioural questions. And behavioural questions versus theoretical questions are just how you've you know, treated problems in the past, or what your experience, you know, has shown that you do in these occasions. Okay, whereas theoretical, you know, I could say something like, look, what would you do if we had to send 3 people to the moon next week? That's a theoretical question. But, you know, behavioural framing would be, now when you went to the moon, tell me about some of the problems that you faced, or what did you have to overcome? So behavioural questions are always about your behaviour in the past. And most people with, you know, even a little bit of experience can generally answer some of those questions. Where you'll run into trouble is if you've had no experience at all. So people that have not had a part-time job, have not done any volunteer work, and are yet to begin their, you know, role in a workforce, I think they struggle a bit. So that's why part-time jobs and volunteer work is so important while you're building your experience-based base. Okay, so these are some of the ways that employers will frame these behavioural questions. Can you describe a situation? Well, of course, you've all been in situations, you know. Can you provide an example of how you solved a problem or dealt with a difficult customer? So the employers are expecting you to draw on all sorts of examples from all of those areas of your life that might be relevant to this. And using a framework is a really great way to showcase, you know, all of your skills and experience. And also, I think it makes you less nervous. I'm going to show you the STAR framework. Some of you may have well come across this. It's really easy to remember. Once you've seen it today, you're not going to forget it. And it's going to be useful not only for making you feel more relaxed during interviews, because you should never go blank again. If you can remember the STAR model, you always have a reference to think, oh, that's right. Okay, I can't think of an example straight away, but let me think about the STAR framework. And then, okay, I have been in that situation. I have done that task. And this is what I did, the action I took. And this is what, you know, the results were once I'd done all that. Now, if you're really clever, you can turn STAR into STARE and evaluate it at the end. You might say, well, this is the, you know, the action I took, but in hindsight, you know, if I was going to do it again, then this is how I would do it differently. But that's, you know, once you've got, you know, the situation, task, action and results ready, then you can evaluate. Okay, and like I said, you can use this to answer your selection criteria questions, because often you can, you know, they're really difficult sometimes, and thinking up an answer to fill, you know, half a page. But if you use the STAR framework, then, you know, it shouldn't take you long to think of examples. So here's what the STAR model looks like. So when I'm practicing for an interview, I just draw a big rectangle, you know, with a texter or a pen, and I do my STAR, and then I start to brainstorm with myself what possible questions might come up at this interview that I'm going to go for. And then I write down the answers and, you know, practice with myself, basically. Some people like to practice with a friend. Some people practice in the mirror. I've heard of people practicing with their cat. I do know of someone, I don't recommend this, but they practice while they drive. Really should be focused on the road, but that's where they practice their interview questions. So the STAR model, okay, and if you need some extra readings on this, there's loads of information online. Just type in STAR model and all the examples will come up. Okay, so that's just describing it a little bit more. So the situation and or the task that needed to be achieved. I've got an example in a minute so that you can see this actually playing out. always try and keep the focus on you. So many people say my team or we, whereas really in an interview, we're trying to find out what you actually did and what your part was in getting the results that you did. Okay, so here's an example. Provide an example of your experience in supporting others and working collaboratively to achieve common team goals. Consider how you handled team member differences and the skills and attributes you brought to the team. So here is, you know, a couple of sentences that someone may have used in an interview to answer that. So I'll just give you a little minute to read through, and then think in your own mind, okay, how could I, you know, put my own skills and experience into an answer like that. Okay, so some more tips for what happens during the interview. So always arrive early. If it's in an in-person interview, then you really need to know where you're going and arrive on time. I did have a friend that thought he knew where he was going, and so he was a little bit relaxed. He got to the interview half hour before and sat in his car thinking, oh, it's a little bit too early to go in yet. And then I think at about 10 minutes to interview time, he realised that he didn't know which building he was going to interview in. And it was a really large complex. And in the end, he ended up being late and very stressed, probably only late by about 5 minutes. But, you know, when you're late for an interview, that you're already starting, you know, behind. So always make sure you know where you're going. Never assume that it's going to be easy to find. In fact, a run through, you know, at a time prior to the interview is always good, so you know exactly where you can park or where the bus is going to drop you off and where the building is and how many flights of stairs you might have to get there. It's always good to really have a look. Up you don't have to go anywhere if it's a virtual interview, but again, you do need to make sure your technology is ready and, you know, up to speed with everything you might need to do. Your bandwidth's fine and everything, you know, you're not going to run out of battery. So make sure you've got everything under control, and always arrive about 5 minutes early for your virtual interview as well. Okay. Definitely turn off your phone. Okay, I have had a friend that left his phone in his pocket and it wasn't ringing, but he could feel it vibrating, and it was just distracting him from the panel answers he was meant to be giving. Now, shaking hands is no longer going to be appropriate in social situations or in interview situations, but I think it's going to be interesting people are going to forget that. So there's going to be a whole bunch of hands waving out in the air until people remember. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when people wouldn't shake my hand because, you know, maybe I was seen as too young, or you didn't shake hands with women, and that obviously has changed over the years. But it's going to be interesting to see those awkward sort of situations when people are, oh, they go to shake hands and then it's like, oh no, we can't do that anymore. Now, one of the other things is you may well know who's interviewing you beforehand. You probably got an email or a letter that tells you who the panel are, what their titles are, what their names are. But if you can repeat, you know, their name back when you meet them, it often helps you to remember, because there's nothing worse than being introduced to somebody and then not being able to remember their name straight away. So, you know, try and repeat it back, and then it will be there, right, you know, at the forefront of your mind. Now, smiling. So interviews and who people hire is generally about likability, and the way to get people to like you, you know, psychologists have proven, is by smiling. So don't forget about that. And, you know, when we're on the phone, I know salespeople are often trained to smile no matter what, because that smile tends to come through at the other end of the phone, and people are perceived to be, you know, warmer and friendlier. Okay, minimising clutter during the interview. I'm sort of talking here about an in-person interview, you know, with what you actually take into the room, and it might be your phone and a folder in your handbag, or, you know, for men, definitely be phones, and you might bring in a copy of your resume, but, you know, try to keep it all in some form of order. And hands. Hands are a big one. Often people are doing all sorts of things with their hands. When they're nervous, you wouldn't even realize you're doing it. But you know, if you have a folder, that's always a good thing to hold on to, or try and keep your hands in you know, relaxed in your lap. And I did have a question that came in prior to doing this webinar today, and it was about, how do I stop myself shaking? You know, I just feel so nervous in an interview. How can I get that under control? And there's something we can all do, you know, right now that you know, so you remember in the future. But if you want your hands to stop shaking, one of the techniques you can use is sort of below the desk. Okay, so no one that you're interviewing with is going to notice, but if you press your knees together and tighten up your thighs and your buttocks and right through to your hips and sort of keep that tensed for a little bit, then your hands will stop shaking. Okay, so you might need to do that more than once, but that's a nice tip to sort of remember. Just sort of tense the lower half of your body, and that should stop any hand shaking. Okay, also breathing, of course. You know, your voice, I used to work on radio, so I have a real ear for voices, and if you breathe deeply, your voice will probably not shake as much either. So before you get to interview, try and take some deep breaths. Remember, you know, the people in the interview panel are trying to get the best result possible. They're not there trying to, you know, give you any more stress than, you know, they need to. But it is stressful, and so try and remember your breathing, and that will help you relax as well. Okay, so maintaining eye contact. Now, the more people that are on a panel, whether it's virtual or in person, the harder that is to focus on everyone, but you really must try as hard as you can. Okay, because if you don't give eye contact, often that gives people, you know, just messages that, you know, maybe you're not trustworthy, or it's hard to like people if they're not looking at you. And remember, likability is a big part of getting a job in a team. Okay, so listen carefully to the information supplied. If you're not sure or you'd like a question clarified, ask. There's no problem with getting someone to repeat a question again, particularly if it's a double-barreled or triple-barreled question. Sometimes there's one question with 2 or 3 things that they're looking for. So you can say, oh, sorry, what was the last thing? That's fine. You don't have to hold it all in your head. Okay, let your interviewer guide the questioning. So be careful not to talk too much, and that's when it's really important for you to look at visual clues. It's harder over the screen than it is in person. That's why we're all exhausted lately, because it's much harder to get any sort of feedback over a screen than it is in person. It's much easier when you're all there together. So be aware of when, you know, the interviewer is trying to bring an answer to the end, or they're looking to move on, or when they'd like more information. Okay, so that body language is really important to keep an eye on. Okay, selling your skills, trying to match the needs. Remember the STAR model with this. So always utilize, you know, what situation or task is relevant to this particular question. How can I best answer it? And if you've done your preparation well, you'll have lots and lots of examples that you'll be able to choose from. Okay, what else here? We're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to just speed up a little bit. Again, yeah, don't be afraid of silence. Sometimes you need some time to think about the best answer that you might give. So don't worry, you don't have to instantly speak the minute the question's, you know, given to you. 14 is very important. So no negative comments. We're trying to have a really positive experience in these interviews. So, you know, don't comment on anyone, you know, your former employer, your degree, university, anyone. You never know. I mean, in a place like Adelaide, where I'm talking to you from, it's a very, very small place, and most of us know each other or, you know, we know someone who knows someone here, or they're related. So I think just try and maintain, you know, a positive outlook in your interview, and asking prepared questions. Now, this is something that I've seen from the other side of the interview table. We always expect that candidates will have questions ready. There has to be. If you're going for a new job, you have to have some questions. You know, there must be some questions in your mind. So many times I've seen people say, oh no, I have no questions. And maybe we have answered them during the course of the interview, but you still need to have 1 or 2 questions waiting for the panel, because it just shows, you know, how interested you are in the job. So over the next page, I've got some questions you might ask of the panel. So relocation is a big one these days. So are you expected to relocate interstate or internationally, and how long for? That's something I'd be interested in asking about. People often ask me, well, if I start in this position, where is the career going next? What chance for advancement or training do I have? I think that's another very good question. Reviews of performance, maybe your pay is going to be tied to your performance, so maybe every week your performance is reviewed, or it might be every 6 months or once a year, which is far more common. When would you like me to start? That's very important for you to know. So there's, most people will ask that question. And you can also ask, what stage am I at in this selection process? Is this the first stage? Is it the final stage? Is there going to be another assessment centre, or am I going to have a series of interviews? You need to try and find out in the interview. Okay, so I've nearly run out of time, but I'm quickly going to go through this with you. So this is the career advice I'd give you if you're thinking about, starting, you've finished university and you need your first job, or you're thinking about a career change. The way to find, everyone's going to be saying, where are the jobs? So many jobs have gone missing. What am I going to do? And I think there's a process to work through. So what role do you actually want? I think it's really clear. Really important, to be clear about the role that you actually want. Does it exist? Does it exist in the town or the city that you live in? If not, where does it exist, and might you have to move? So give your top 5 companies or organisations that you'd like to work for a tick, maybe write them down, and then proceed to try and network or get to know people that work in those companies. Okay. Does the company match your corporate value, or does their corporate value match what you're thinking you'd like to do? If you're an animal lover, then there are some companies that wouldn't appeal to you. So you need to sort of line up. If you're very into sustainability and the environment, there are obviously some companies that are not going to match with that. So you really need to think about this, for long-term sustainability of your own career. You need to think about these things and how happy you're going to be. Okay, so when looking for jobs, who you know. 100 years ago it was who you know. In 100 years' time it probably is who you know. Who you know is very important. If you want to work for a company and you have no contacts within that company, it's important to try and make some contacts. Okay, so many jobs are hidden. They're not ever advertised because somebody knew someone with the right skill set, or were a cultural fit. So they hide them before the job even got to advert. Expansion. So the things that are happening in Adelaide that are expanding, certainly sustainable energy is very big here with batteries and solar panels. Festivals, Adelaide is known as the festival state. And of course, space exploration. We now have something called Lot 14, where we will attract world renowned organisations to come and look at what we're going to do, in space. So in the place that you live, have a look at what's expanding. Where might a role be for you? The other thing is turnover. So are there any jobs in my team today? No, not that I'm aware of. But that doesn't mean there won't be a job tomorrow or next week or next month or next year when someone resigns or goes on maternity leave or retires. As a manager, I actually don't know when I'm going to have a vacancy. So, and neither do other managers. So you might be applying today and you might come second in the role that you really hope to have, but you really don't know when another role is going to come up. So I would say, keep in contact with the people that interviewed you, because 1, the first person may not work out at all, and 2, another job might be created, or certainly when that person is promoted, then the job comes up again. So turnover is always an interesting one. Downsizing, it doesn't mean the end of jobs. So if we have a look at, say, supermarkets that have taken away a lot of checkout roles at the front because now they're all automated and we do it ourselves, well, the increase in the business there would have been in the technology, okay, and the IT at the back end. So downsizing doesn't necessarily mean the whole company's downsizing. new business opening or new jobs being invented, just keep your eyes open. You know, what's happening in your city mall or down the street or in your local university. You know, what's new and exciting and what might need human resources. And finally, and this is how I came into my education, jobs that no one else wants. So if you pick up a job that no one else wants, it could be the door that opens to something bigger and better. So I wasn't a qualified teacher when I started teaching at TAFE, but I'd been a workplace trainer in lots of jobs. And no one wanted to teach occupational health and safety. So I was in a country town and I was interested in working in education. I saw it as an opening, and I tried to make teaching occupational health and safety as interesting as I could. And it was a very, very high salary, and I'm going back 20 years now. More money than I was earning in hospitality or welfare or any of the other industries I'd worked in, retail. So that was what I did. I did the job that no one else wanted, and I would encourage you to do that as well, especially if it's in an organisation that you're really interested in working with or in a field that you're trying to get into. Lastly, how do you find information? Internet, you can find so much out, you know, just sitting at your desk these days. Again, networking, I've mentioned already. No matter where, you know, you might be at a barbecue, you might be, you know, with your family, you might be sitting with people in a university course. You never know who they're going to become or who they know. We never know who's going to sit on the other side of the interview table. So talk to people you know and also people you don't know. Don't be afraid of that. If you see a job advertised online or in print or someone talks about it and there's a contact person, then get in contact with them and try and find out more information about it. Remember though that that's going to be your first interview. An informational interview is still an interview. Okay, attend professional association meetings. You'll get to know people in the field. Go to conferences. Any way you can associate with people in the field you're trying to get into is, you know, a way to get in the front door. And again, look outside capital cities. There are so many opportunities in regional Australia, and you can gain a lot of experience out of a city that you can then, if you want to come back, bring back with you. It's what I did. I moved around in regional Northern Territory in South Australia for 10 years, and I brought all of that experience back with me, and it helps me greatly in some of the jobs I do now. And lastly, which is sort of what you're doing now, seek out a career advisor and get some professional advice, especially if you're looking to change careers after being in a career for a very, very long time. So I think that is the end of my presentation, and now we're going to open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was awesome. So everyone, if you want to ask a question, there is a Q&A box there. Looks like we already have many questions. So first one, what tips can you give us to prepare for the assessment questions to be selected for an interview?
Well, the assessment questions to be selected for an interview. Okay, so I think what that question is asking is, in order to get to an interview, what questions are likely to appear either on a virtual recorded interview prior or over the phone. I would say just Google. There are hundreds and hundreds of questions on Google. If you know someone who's working in that particular field or in that company, maybe ask them what processes they went through. But I think for preparing for interview questions, definitely Google and practice as much as you can. You know, that's what I've done over the years, try and really practice hard for what I think, you know, try and work out what they might ask you. And you can always refer to the advertisement, any document relating, you know, to the job will give you a clue as to what they're looking for. You know, the selection criteria will give you a clue, especially if it's saying you must have these things. They're going to ask you about it at an interview. So yeah, there's a bit of guesswork, but I think you can narrow it down a fair bit as well.
Great. And
sorry, carry on, Winnie.
Yeah, how early is too early to arrive to an interview?
I think you can be too early. I know that sounds really weird, but I think you can. If you're driving, you can park in the car park and wait. You know, I think 10 minutes, you know, if you can arrive, but, you know, 5 to 10 minutes early to get where you really need to go. You can sit in a chair for a minute, relax, calm down, do your deep breathing. I think that would be enough. You don't want to seem too eager. Like, you have other places to be, remember. There are other people that might want your skills as well. And some people have 2 and 3 job applications going at the one time. So remember that the job interview is a two-way thing. You're trying to work out, do I want to work for this company? Don't forget that. It's not just them choosing you. It's about you choosing, well, does this sound like the place I want to spend the next year or 5 years? Okay, so you're interviewing them as well.
All right, we have a good one here. Does appearing nervous during an interview affect your chances of getting selected for the job?
That's a really good question. And no, because I think panel, or I'm always on a panel, but interviewers would generally expect people to be nervous, and I think the more you want the job, the more nervous you actually are. So I do know of people that have gone for interviews just for, I hate to say this, the practice. Okay, they sort of wanted the job, but it wasn't the dream job, so they went for a practice. And if you're still at university, you can go and talk to your career services and have mock interviews. We have technology for that these days. Sometimes we do it in person. So yeah, I think everyone is nervous. If you can try and control it as much as you can, because if it gets too much, you're not going to perform. You're not going to perform at your best. So you need to do as much as you can to take the nerves out of it. And I think by being prepared, going through some of the things we've talked about today, the more prepared you are, the less nervous you're going to be.
I agree. You just mentioned that maintaining eye contact is super important during an interview. But how do you do that during an online interview? Is it expected for us to, stare at the camera?
It's really difficult. I think the best way is to look at your camera. Like, I'm looking right at my camera now. Rather than trying to look down or up, or like, that's where the positioning of your device comes in. Really, it's really important. But yeah, it's just about giving the attention to the person that's asking the question, and trying to look at your camera. I think that is the key to making it look like you're looking at somebody.
Right. I think we have time for 3 questions. Okay. So what about giving negative comments when answering behavioral questions? Is that okay? Like, for example, I had a bad teammate and how I overcame the problem.
Look, I think life is life, isn't it? Not everything goes to plan. And in interviews, we're often trying to find out when things went off the rails or went wrong. And yeah, I think it's okay to say, look, I was in a group and there was one person not pulling their weight. Like, yeah, but the important thing is to not blame other people, not sort of put all the blame on that person, because of course we'll be asking, well, that person wasn't carrying their weight, but what did you do to try and get them back on track? Or how did you get a result, even though you had, the person who was, a bit of a weak link? What did you actually do? So the question will always be refocused onto you anyway. But it's, you can call a situation out and describe it as it was. I think being honest is really important.
All right, I'll just select 2 more questions to be answered. So what advice can you give for boosting myself on paper to gain an interview? Like, my last job was like 2011, and I feel a lot of potential employers dismiss me on that.
Okay, it's all about relevance. So what have you done in your workplace and in your training and in your personal life that makes you, you're going to be really valuable for this next opportunity? It's all about relevance and lifelong learning. Like, most degrees, I think, in my own life, I've looked at my degrees and after 10 years thought, well, I really need to go and do another one to try and update those skills. So, and at the moment, a lot of talk around micro credentials. So little tiny courses that you might be able to pick up to, increase your skills in analysis or in, some sort of like Excel or whatever program you need, Photoshop. There are these little tiny leadership. I've seen leadership coming up quite a bit as well. So there's, little things you can do, even though, you've been in a job since 2011. I mean, it's not like you stopped learning. You learned a lot of things in that role, and it's all about making, the most of those.
All right, so our last one. How do you respond when you don't have an answer to a behavioral question in the interview?
Okay, so if you think about the STAR model and that still doesn't assist you, if you've never been in that situation, I think it's just important to be honest and say, well, you know, I've never been in that situation, but this is how I would, you know, I think I would approach it if it came, you know, in real life to me. So just being honest, you can't make anything up. If, you know, the employer will just work out if you're fluffing your way through. So much better to be honest if you really don't have an answer. But I'd also say, you know, if you really thought about the question, and let's take it out of a work context, you could probably answer it using examples from, you know, if you participate in a church, or, you know, you're involved in sport like soccer or basketball, or you've umpired somewhere, or even your own family. If you think about your own family, it's a team. Okay, might be a team of 2, might be a team of, you know, 5, 6. So try to answer as best you can, but, you know, you don't have to contain it to a work situation. Maybe think outside and you might have an answer.
That's really fantastic advice. I think, you know, because we have so many questions and we've been able to cover some of them. Thank you to everyone for asking such fantastic questions, for engaging in this topic. We'll try to circle back to you afterwards. And thank you again, Sue. This was just amazing, and thank you for taking time today to, you know, share your experience and expertise with us. So take care, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye. Best of luck, everyone.
Bye.